Good evening, everyone. This is Ashley from Written in Ash, and tonight I'm going to be doing a scary story reading from the book 13 Ghosts, Strange but True Stories by Will Osborne. Tonight's story that I'm going to be reading is The Airman Who Flew Back from the Dead. "Hello, boy." Lieutenant Larkin jumped at the voice and the tap on his window. He looked up startled, then he grinned. It was only his roommate, David McConnell. "Thought you were flying to Tadcaster this morning," Larkin said. "I am. Forgot my map." McConnell pointed through the window at a map on his desk. "Can you hand it to me, please?" Lieutenant Larkin passed the map through the window. He watched his friend hurry off toward the hangars, then went back to reading his paper. The date was December 7th, 1918, and World War I was finally over. Lieutenants McConnell and Larkin were both pilots in the British Air Force, sharing a room in the pilots' quarters of their home base in Scampton, England. Officially, McConnell was still only a trainee. He was 18 years old. McConnell's unexpected flight assignment that day was fairly routine. He was to deliver a single-seater plane called a Sopwith Camel to the airfield at Tadcaster, about 60 miles away. Another pilot would follow him there in a larger two-seater plane called an Avro. Once the Camel was safely delivered, McConnell would fly back home with the second pilot. The skies were fair that morning in Scampton. McConnell told his roommate Larkin he expected to be back in time for tea. "The commander says we should use our own judgment," Lieutenant McConnell said, hanging up the phone. He grinned at the pilot of the Avro, who looked up at the gray winter sky. "I think that means we go ahead." The Avro pilot nodded, and the two men pulled up their helmets and headed for their planes. They had been forced to land because of a sudden heavy fog, but from the ground the fog didn't look too bad, and Lieutenant McConnell was eager to get his mission over with and get back to Scampton. Once in the air, however, McConnell began to worry. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every mile. Finally, McConnell's partner was forced to bring a larger plane down again, this time in an open field. Lieutenant McConnell circled the ground, trying to decide what to do. His arms were already tired from trying to hold his little plane steady in the wind, and the fog was showing no signs of thinning out. But he was over halfway to the aerodrome at Tadcaster. A forced landing in an open field might be almost as dangerous as continuing on. On the ground, the pilot of the Avro was climbing out of his cockpit. McConnell flew his plane in low enough to see that the man wasn't hurt, then pulled back on the stick and headed off into the fog. "Hello, boy." Lieutenant Larkin turned in his chair to see his friend McConnell grinning at him from the doorway. McConnell was still wearing his flying clothes, but had exchanged his helmet for the naval cap he had always worn around his base. He seemed in good spirits. "Hello, Lieutenant," Larkin said, closing the book he had been reading. "Back already?" "Yes," said McConnell. "Got there all right and had a good trip." McConnell turned to go. "Well, cheerio," he said, and banged out the door. Lieutenant Larkin settled back in his chair, found his place in his book, and went on with his reading. That night, the smoking room of the Albion Hotel in Lincoln was crowded with officers from the base. The air buzzed with the sound of their conversations as Lieutenant Larkin made his way toward the big stone fireplace in the corner. Larkin hadn't seen his roommate McConnell since the brief conversation that afternoon. Another officer had come by the room later and suggested that he and McConnell might be going to Lincoln that evening, and Larkin expected he would run into the two of them there at the hotel. He set his drink down on the mantel and looked around the room for his friend. A small group of officers was sitting at a table not far from the fireplace. One of the men was telling a story, and Larkin could tell from the other officer's expressions that the subject was a serious one. Curious, he lit a cigarette and leaned in toward the group. Lieutenant Larkin couldn't make out exactly what was being said, but he did overhear the words "crashed" and "Tadcaster." He began to grow worried, and then he heard the man distinctly say "McConnell." He crushed out his cigarette and went over to the table. "I'm sorry, but were you talking about David McConnell?" Larkin said. "That's right," the officer said, nodding sadly. "It's a shame. He got the word just before we left the base. Poor fellow." What do you mean? Lieutenant Larkin said. I saw him just this afternoon. He was in fine spirits. The officer looked at the other men at the table and shook his head. I'm sorry, friend, but you didn't see David McConnell this afternoon. You couldn't have. He took a nosedive and crashed on the runway trying to bring his plane into Tadcaster in the fog. The officer looked up at Lieutenant Larkin. David McConnell was killed this afternoon. It wasn't until the following day that Lieutenant Larkin was able to put together all the pieces of the story, and even then he couldn't believe what had happened. It was true. McConnell had crashed on his approach into the Tadcaster airfield when the plane hit the runway. McConnell's head had struck the gun mounted in front of the pilot's seat. He was dead before anyone could reach him. Lieutenant Larkin knew the approximate time he saw his roommate for the last time. It had been 3:20 and 3:30 that afternoon that made the incident especially strange. McConnell had been wearing a watch when his plane went down at Tadcaster. The watch was broken in the impact of the crash. The hands of the watch had stopped at the exact moment of McConnell's death. It was at 3:25 p.m. Lieutenant Larkin would remember that afternoon for the rest of his life. He knew he was awake, and he knew without a doubt that the man standing in the doorway was his roommate and friend David McConnell. Perhaps the young lieutenant had come to say goodbye. Perhaps he didn't know he had crashed. But David McConnell had definitely come home from his mission that day, if only for a moment. He was the airman who flew back from the dead. The end. This case is an example of what researchers call a death coincidence, in which a person at the moment of his death appears to a friend or family member in a distant location. All the details of the case were reported by Lieutenant Larkin himself in a letter to McConnell's father, and the case was later investigated by noted British ghost researcher. It is considered to be one of the best cases of this type on record.
Don't be scared. Like, subscribe, share.